Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a dark, little-known story from the American Civil War. It's a tale of revenge. Perfect, brutal revenge. Carried out not with guns or knives, but with the very animals a man was forced to care for. So let's set the scene. It's September 14th, 1864, at a place called Riverside Estate in Virginia. Now, this was a wealthy tobacco plantation, but by this point in the war, it was teetering on the brink of collapse. The Confederacy was losing, the money was drying up, and the men running the place were getting desperate, and a whole lot more dangerous.
And on this particular night, four very powerful men, would not live to see the morning.
They died right there in their own paddock, crushed beneath the hooves of the horses they owned.
But here's the thing, this was no accident. And it wasn't some kind of divine justice either. This was revenge, planned so perfectly, so meticulously, that no one even dared to speak the truth. Okay, so let's dig into this. What really happened? The county coroner came in, took one look, and quickly ruled the whole thing a tragic accident. But, the moment you start looking at the details, that official story just completely falls apart.
The official story was simple, right? The horses just randomly panicked. A freak accident. But come on, think about it for a second. We're talking about 4 separate victims, not a single cluster. And these weren't novices. These guys were lifelong horsemen. They knew how to handle a spooked animal. But here's the real kicker. The one person who knew those horses better than anyone on earth, their stable master, Thomas Garrett, he just vanishes. Poof, gone without a trace. Accidents don't leave clues like that.
So, to really get why this happened, you have to understand who these victims were. These 4 men, they held absolute power at Riverside. They even had a name for themselves, the Riverside Council. And look, these guys weren't your typical one-note villains. Their cruelty was specific. You had Edmund, the owner, who thought of himself as this benevolent master, which really just meant he'd only have you whipped for things he thought were a big deal. Then there was his brother Charles, just a bitter, angry guy who took out his frustrations on anyone weaker than him. Marcus Whitfield, the business partner, he was all about the bottom line. He saw human beings as numbers on a spreadsheet. And then you have Daniel Cross, the overseer. This guy was a master of psychological torture, using systematic, unpredictable violence just to break people's spirits. And caught in the middle of all of this was one man, Thomas Garrett. He was the estate's brilliant stable master, but he was also enslaved. For 15 long years, he cared for the horses, serving these men who didn't even see him as a human being. And this right here, this gets to the absolute heart of the conflict. For the masters, these horses were just property, an asset, an investment, livestock. But for Thomas, they were his entire world. In a life where he had no family and no freedom, these animals were the only beings that showed him any kind of affection or trust. They were his family.
You have to understand, his 15 years at Riverside were a slow, brutal accumulation of trauma, death by 1,000 cuts, getting whipped for things that weren't his fault, being forced to watch his friend Jacob get sold, torn away from his own family. And maybe the worst of all, the woman he loved, Ruth, died of a fever while he was forced to go saddle a horse for his master's casual afternoon ride. But the final straw, the thing that pushed him over the edge, came in August of 1864. He overheard them, the council. They were planning to sell him away from his horses. And that's when 15 years of pain finally hardened into a plan.
So he's backed into a corner. He has just 10 days until he's supposed to be sold. And he comes up with this plan that is it's both brilliant and absolutely horrifying. He decided to turn the only things he loved into weapons. And the way he did it was incredible. He used his deep understanding of animal psychology. He knew each horse's personality inside and out. He taught Edmund's territorial stallion to attack on a whistle. He trained Charles's nervous mare to bolt toward a target with just a hand gesture. And he taught the overseer's young stallion to deliver a devastating kick on the single command, strike. I mean, the level of detail is just insane. He even sabotaged a bridge miles away, knowing it would delay a potential horse buyer and ensure his 4 targets would be alone and unsuspecting. So, on the night of September 14th, all the pieces of this terrible plan came together right there in the paddock. Thomas's plan to sabotage the bridge worked perfectly. The buyer's carriage collapsed, delaying him indefinitely. Frustrated but eager for entertainment, the 4 masters ordered Thomas to bring all 17 horses into the paddock for their own private show, creating the exact scenario he had engineered. They walked right into his trap. As the men stood there watching, Thomas began. A subtle raise of his hand, and the mare Tempest bolted, trampling Charles Harrington. A sharp whistle, and the stallion's sovereign charged, striking down the owner, Edmund.
Before anyone could even react, another horse slammed into Marcus Whitfield at the fence, and as the overseer, Daniel Cross, finally drew a pistol, Thomas uttered a single, final command: strike.
The paddock became this maelstrom of hooves and dust, but in the middle of the chaos he had unleashed, Thomas Garrett remained completely unharmed. The horses he had turned into killers still recognized him as their caretaker. That bond, built over 15 years, was the one thing that couldn't be broken.
When the violence was over and all 4 men were dead, Thomas Garrett simply walked out of the paddock, right through the stunned crowd of onlookers, and disappeared into the night. He left behind a scene of carnage and a story that defies any easy answers.
The authorities, of course, they buried the truth. They called it a tragic accident, because the alternative, the idea that an enslaved man had orchestrated such perfect, intelligent revenge against 4 powerful white men, was just too terrifying for that collapsing social order to admit.
And in the aftermath, a conspiracy of silence protected Thomas. The other slaves, when they were questioned, claimed to know nothing. The horses, once they were sold, never showed aggression again, proving they weren't monsters, they were instruments. And Thomas Garrett? He was never found. He vanished, leaving behind only a legend.
This leaves us with a profound moral dilemma, doesn't it? This isn't a simple story of good versus evil. It's about what happens when a person is pushed far beyond their limits in a system that offers absolutely no hope.
Remember the context? Thomas existed in a system that defined him as property. The law was not on his side. The law was his enemy. He had been beaten, humiliated, and had seen the woman he loved die because of his master's indifference. He had no court to appeal to, no rights to claim.
Which leads us to the final unsettling question. When the law itself is the instrument of your oppression, what does justice even mean? We call what Thomas Garrett did murder, but in a world that denied his very humanity, he may have called it the only justice he had left. What would you call it?